Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel Theocracy or Anarchy, Religion and the State in Russian Philosophy, Vladimir Soloviev and Nikolai Berdiaev. And the panel is presented by the Russian and Eastern European Studies Network, REES. And I'm here and opening this panel as the REES coordinator. The group was formed in 2018 out of a desire to bring greater awareness of Russia and Eastern Europe to Queen's University. We are an interdisciplinary group of scholars of history, philosophy, politics, Jewish studies, and we have brought a wide variety of events to Queen's in our short almost already 3 years of existence, including film series, informational sessions on current events, such as presidential elections in Russia and Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and quite a few talks by professors and public figures from Queen's and beyond in the past 3 years. If you'd like to learn about our further events and to be a part of our community, please Google us, subscribe and follow. We have all the main channels of communication, including Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Now I'm turning the floor to Professor David Bakhurst of the Department of Philosophy, Queen's University, to introduce the panel and panelists. Please, David.
Thank you very much, Vasily, and welcome everyone to this event. Our topic today is the relation of church and state, a question which takes a characteristically dramatic and philosophically intense form in Russian thought, particularly in the so-called Silver Age of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We welcome two outstanding speakers to help us think about these matters. And I will introduce them in a second. I should say that the way we're going to do this is that Boris Mezhuev will give the first presentation, speaking for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. And then Anna Siljak will speak, same format. And if there's time at the end, we can open things up to a general discussion. That's the plan. So let me introduce the speakers, starting with our own Anna Siljak, who is professor in the history department at Queen's. Her recent articles include Nikolai Berdiaev and the Origins of Russian Messianism, published in the Journal of Modern History, Sigmund Freud, Sublimation and the Russian Silver Age, published in Modern Intellectual History, and Friedrich Nietzsche, Dmitry Merezhkovsky, and the Russian Renaissance, published in Canadian Slavonic Papers. It'll be obvious from those publications that among her areas of expertise is the Russian Silver Age, expertise recognized by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is presently funding her research on the aesthetics of a Russian cultural renaissance of the late 19th century. And Anna will be speaking on The Kingdom of God is Anarchy, Berdiaev, Religion and the State. Our other speaker who will speak first, we're delighted to welcome Boris Mezhuev, who's lecturer in the Department of the History of Russian Philosophy at Moscow State University. He's a member of the editorial board at work on the complete works and letters of Vladimir Soloviev. He plays a leading role in the editorial board of Politichesky Konservatism website. He's a member of the editorial board of the journals Solovievsky Исследования, Soloviev Studies, Polis, which is a journal of political research, and Tietradi po konservatismu, notebooks on conservatism. And he will be speaking to us today, giving a talk based on his, I believe, on his paper, The Meaning of the State, the Byzantine Idea on the Pages of a Liberal Journal, a paper that appeared in Solovievsky Исследования last year. So with no further ado, let's welcome Boris Mezhuev.
Well, thank you very much for my introduction for me. And excuse me for my insufficient English, and if I cannot speak fluently, excuse me for that. But I would like my presentation is devoted to not so popular article by Vladimir Soloviev, which was written and published in 1895 in December in the Herald of Europe. It called the Meaning of State. And it's a very strange publication because it was a publication which devoted to the idea of theocracy, idea of the autocracy, Byzantium idea, as Vladimir Soloviev stressed. And he would like to propose idea of autocracy, idea of Byzantium, and he called it Byzantium idea, on the pages of liberal constitutional article, liberal constitutional issue, liberal constitutional journal. And it was just like a scandal because many contemporaries of Vladimir Soloviev stressed and noticed that it was a very strange for liberal constitutional journal to publish of the article of so kind. And after that, it was a big problem for Vladimir Soloviev because he must justify his decision to publish this article. And the right press, the right journals and the right observers said that time that maybe Soloviev moved from the liberal circles to conservative circles. But before that, I would like to begin my presentation from another prominent thinker, not Russian, but German, Immanuel Kant. And I would like to start my presentation from his the famous article, What is Enlightenment, from 1784. And maybe you remember that Immanuel Kant wrote that the Enlightenment, it is an exit of a man from the state of infancy in which he is situated by his own making, that infancy is an inability to use his own reason without the leadership by something else. I think that's possible to, after that, in his article, Immanuel Kant wrote that we should think of a courage. We must name it courage to use the reason without leadership by something else. But as you know, in the Anglo-Saxon literature right now, from approximately 1973, after the publication of the article by Isaiah Berlin, The Enemies of Enlightenment, the big argument goes on. It's about the phenomenon of a counter-enlightenment. And right now, I think that's a big argument, a big contest between the thinkers who thought that enlightenment, counter-enlightenment, is maybe it's a right name for some thinkers who opposed enlightenment from the right positions. And many others thought that counter-enlightenment is an incorrect name because counter-enlightenment is it's incorrect. But I think that right now that the idea of this article of meaning of the state might lead us to the conclusion that it's possible to imagine another answer on this question, the question of Kant, that we might have a courage not to use our own reason without leadership by something else. We must not think about ourselves that we are right now adult, that we may be not adult, we might be in the state of infancy, and might be we must have a leadership by something else. And it is a tradition of counter-enlightenment from the Joseph de Maistre, and it has a big history in Russian thought, from Chadaev, for example, who showed us on the example of Moses, who lead Jews in the desert, and they, of course, must adopt the leadership of Moses. And another tradition of counter-enlightenment in Russia, which saw something else as a Russian Tsar. And it was the same tradition which just found the continuation in Vladimir Soloviev. Vladimir Soloviev thought that it's possible to combine two possible leadership of Russian civilization and European civilization. European civilization it was just under leadership of the Roman Pope. And Russian civilization is under leadership of Russian Tsar. And it's contrast to Chadaev, contrast to Fyodor Tyutchev and other Russian counter-enlightenment thinkers. He thought that we need to combine these two figures of Roman Pope and Russian Tsar in the just a combination of that. And he called this combination free theocracy. And you know that in Russian historical philosophical tradition, it was just a big tendency to think of late Soloviev, the latest period of Vladimir Soloviev, just a rejection of the idea of theocracy. That in his work, just now I study the work, the justification of good. Soloviev didn't write about theocracy, and by that many thinkers from Prince Eugene Trubetskoy came to conclusion that Soloviev at that time rejected the idea of theocracy. And I think that it's not correct, because we have a plan of brief plan, and not brief, it's a very concrete plan of this treatise. It was we can find it in the letter of Vladimir Soloviev to the Prince Sergei Trubetskoy, that in this previous plan he just wrote that the ideal of the free theocracy, it was a chapter 9 in the part 3 of his future treatise. He called it the foundations of the moral philosophy. And I think that the treatise, the meaning of state, it was just an idea. It was just this chapter. He would like to put this article in his treatise at the chapter 9. But after that, he wrote in this article, in the article of the meaning of state, that we just must to distinguish two ideas of state. European idea of state, which was found on the idea of a balance of powers, ideas about just a balance and the constitution like just resolution of this balance, or the resolution of the conflict between classes, between different powers, between different nations, between different forces, which combine the social basis of the state. And this idea he attributed to French historian François Guizot, which was the most prominent historian during the 19th century. And another idea of Byzantium idea, an idea that the state and the society must have the leadership, must have something prominent, something superior than man. And this force must lead the society to some, not just he think about progress, to the just moral future. The future that must be characterized by the moral prevalence. And in his previous article, in his previous speech about the medieval worldview and just a decline of medieval worldview in 1891, He thought that in the European society, this force, there's a force that lead the society toward the moral state. It is just a spirit of Christ, but the spirit of God, but it was made by unbelievers. The unbelievers were just the bearers of a spirit of the world spirit. This idea was criticized by right journalists, like, for example, Konstantin Leontiev, and maybe you know him, and Yuri Nikolaev, which it was a pseudonym of Yuri Говоруха Otrok. And Soloviev was confronted by many forces from the right. And in this article in 1895, I think he changed his mind, he changed his view, and he thought that we need to imagine a spiritual force. He, in this article, The Meaning of State, he returned to the idea of theocracy. And he thought that Byzantium idea, the right idea, Byzantium idea, the idea that it's impossible to imagine that the progress can go on by its own force. And we need to imagine, we need to put just a spiritual force. And he thought that is the idea of Tsar, who lead the society toward the humanization of the state. And he thought that the Byzantium herself, wasn't, couldn't be just, he proposed this idea, but couldn't be the bearer of this idea, because Byzantium isn't a sufficient society. In the Byzantium, the desperation, the division between the religious, spiritual ideas and the social being, it was just prominent. It was not true. And he thought that the Russian idea, maybe the idea of Russian so civilization, might be said, but not European civilization, but Russian idea, is to combine the Byzantium idea of the moral leadership of Tsar and the European idea of progress. We need to combine them. It was just maybe a right Russian idea, but he never wrote about Russian idea in this period of time, because Russian idea, it was a work by Vladimir Soloviev, and in his speech he took in Paris in 1889. But in this time, he not so much speak about Russia, not so much wrote about Russia, but I think it's possible to think about that. After that, he wrote two articles by the common title Byzantism and Russia. And after that, he would like to say that Russian Tsar, Russian monarchy, Russian autocracy wasn't impossible, wasn't sufficient without the assistance of the spiritual leader of Europe, of Roman Pope. And after that, clerical and right circles understood that Vladimir Soloviev wouldn't like to return to conservative circles, and he would like to stay in his special position between liberal, who stood for constitutional ideas, and right persons and right articles, right newspaper, right issues, which stood for Russian monarchy without any assistance from a Roman Pope and any religious leaders from the West. I think it's interesting to understand, to think about these ideas, because I think that it was an end of Russian counter-enlightenment. maybe end, because after that we don't see any prominent Russian philosopher, prominent Russian thinker who stood for this idea. So the idea of Russian autocracy, I think, finished on Soloviev. After that, we see, for example, Lev Tikhomirov, Vasily Rozanov, who stood for Russian monarchy. But I think just Vladimir Soloviev was a very prominent Russian philosopher who stood for this idea and rejected idea of constitutional democracy, which was a favorite idea of, for example, Thurkos, of his father. And I think there was just counter-enlightenment, would just found this end in Vladimir Soloviev. But we need to say that it's interesting to think about that, because Vladimir Soloviev, this article, he didn't include it in his treatise Justification of Good. We don't see the special chapter, the meaning of state, and the idea of theocracy and the state and theocracy and free theocracy in his treatise about moral philosophy. And I think we need to understand why. Might be he fear that he just opposed his liberal, how to say, allies. Liberal allies in the Herald of Europe, and if he put this article in this as a chapter, he cannot be in this camp. It may be the true, because many leftist and populist writers like Akim Volinsky, for example, or Vladimir Goltsev, accused Vladimir Soloviev that he rejected in his article from his good liberal ideas, and that's why it's just a fault by Vladimir Soloviev to publish other article of so kind. And Prince Sergei Trubetskoy thought that. He thought that Soloviev is too conservative from the liberal circles of the Moscow State University. Moscow University, and might be Soloviev changed his mind, but I think it's not changing his mind. I think that he understood that after that he need to make the idea of the combination, the unity between Russian Tsar and Roman Pope, make more clear. And in 1997 he had a dispute with a Russian Slavophile general Kireev, who asked Vladimir Soloviev very directly what idea of unity between, what kind of unity between Roman Catholicism and Russian Orthodoxy he saw. Would he like to make a unity with a Russian Catholicism which stood for infallibility of Roman Pope? Or he would like to join old Catholic, as General Kireev proposed himself. And Soloviev rejected to answer. He said in his article, his letter to the newspaper New Time, which was unpublished yet. He was published at that time, but we couldn't see this letter, knowing the collection of his works or collection of his letters, that he couldn't answer, because he right now didn't have a power to answer in the situation when his the main treatise about Roman Catholicism, Russian and all unity, Russian and all unity circle, the universal circle, Russian and universal circle, wasn't yet published in Russia, and that's why he refused to answer publicly on the idea of the unity. That's why he would like not to speak publicly about his own idea about the unity, about the theocracy. But I think he didn't change his mind. He stood for theocracy, till the end of his days. He stood for the idea of the unity between Russian Tsar and Roman Pope, and he think that the society must have a alien force which leads him toward the progress. And we cannot rely in the idea of progress on the own forces of society itself. That society itself and the combination of powers, the balance of powers, couldn't lead the society toward anything well. And we just need to have a leadership by something else, and this something else is a special institution from the past, that is the Pope and the Tsar, Imperator and the Pope. And he only add to this dualism the idea of the prophet, that the prophet is the third figure in the theocracy. And he thought that the exclusion of Jewish people from Christian world, it was a exclusion of the world which created prophets, because he thought that the prophetic foundation was connected to Jewish origin for his ideas. And I think it's an interesting idea, that the idea of not only theocracy and free theocracy, but the idea of the counter-enlightenment. The counter-enlightenment, I think, from the view of Kant, is a second possible way of humanity, way of progress, way of thinking about progress and thinking about humanity as enlightenment itself. And I think that the modern civilization of Europe and maybe modern civilization of Russia is a special combination between these two traits, two forces, the enlightenment and counter-enlightenment. I think that the combination of enlightenment and counter-enlightenment, we need to see the way of European mind and Russian mind as well. And by that reason, I think that the theocracy, not only theocracy like a special idea, but the theocracy a special kind of society, but the theocracy as like a model of counter-enlightenment, is a way of the answer on this question, what is enlightenment? I think that enlightenment is just to have a courage to rely on something else which was more prominent than me, which more serious than me, which might be more educated than me, more older than me. And by that reason, I need to have a courage to rely on his authority. The idea, it was rejected by enlightenment, and maybe by this reason, by this course, it lead the society not to only to the good, but maybe not to anarchy, to the chaos, maybe to the fascism and something other evils, which Soloviev could predict, but of course couldn't encounter himself. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Boris. So the floor is open for questions. If we have a relatively small group, so you can raise your hand visibly, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. Mm-hmm. So questions for Boris. Vladimir Marchenkov.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you very much, Professor Mezhuev, for your presentation. I want to ask you, what role do these ideas play in the contemporary debate on church and state in Russia?
It's a strange. It's interesting question because from the one hand, so contemporary Russia, official Russia, for example, is main I don't know feature, main trait, the core of his values, the idea of sovereignty. Idea of sovereignty isn't the idea of counter-enlightenment. It's the idea of enlightenment. The idea of sovereignty is the idea of a national state. Mm-hmm. And by that reason, I think that idea to need to just to obey something, more serious than me, more older than me, it's not a popular idea in Russia. Right now, Russia, just in the situation of the France of the 17th century, during the period of his sovereignty, of his beginning of its modernity, and that's why it's not so popular. But another way, we need to understand that it's not maybe the final the final resolution, because after the nation, it was the beginning of after the nation, it was just a rise, the era of civilization, and the era of civilization, the era of something more. Not so just maybe not autocracy, but it's just we have a spiritual leader. We have the core and periphery, like in, for example, in European Euro-Atlantic civilization. You have a core and periphery, and a core leads periphery, and a core or make some innovations that periphery must adopt to join the older civilization. And just the hierarchy begins. Civilization is just a hierarchy, the returning of hierarchy. And that's we see just in the Russian civilization too, in the Russian civilization ways too, because we have of course, our core, our spiritual lead, our leaders, our political elite, which would like to make his own ideas more impressive, more forcible, more serious. And I think that's the idea of hierarchy in just way returning with the idea of civilization. From the nation, from civilization. We maybe right now not so we right now spoke about our sovereignty, but after that we spoke about hierarchy in our civilizational field. And I think that's why this idea became maybe more interesting, more popular, something like that. Mm-hmm.
May I follow up with one question?
Certainly, yes.
Thank you. What are the platforms? Your general answer is seems to be about sort of political and historical discourse in general. Are there platforms where philosophers, Russian philosophers, discuss these issues, where they address, exchange ideas, conferences, publications, or maybe standing seminars or something like that? So where are there places and spaces where Russian philosophers discuss these ideas?
No, for example, I spoke about these ideas 2 weeks ago in Kaliningrad during the Kant conference. I spoke about Immanuel Kant. I spoke about that I missed at this point because for me it's interesting to understand how Kant can answer the question what foundation of our adultness we have to make a proposition about that we are adult, that we came from the state of infancy. And I understood, I got that it's impossible to answer this question because pure reason cannot lead us to this proposition, because we don't have special features which can just say that we are adult, because we don't have in historical sense, we don't have a special mustache or beard or something like just features. And our practicalism, despite Fichte, for example, Kant cannot say that we, in all periods of time, can say about ourselves that we must be adult. Not because in the past, for example, in the past of our civilization, we need to say that we are not adult. We don't have a possibility to answer that we know about what make our happy. We don't have a special understanding of the foundations of our happiness. We need to have a master to say that we happy, like we have a parent. We need to have a parent. We need to have a master. Of course, it's just a colonial point of view, but it's interesting for Kant. What are the reasons? Well, what reasons do we have to say that we are adult? And by that reason, I spoke about the big problem in Kantian discourse, that this proposition doesn't have foundations. We have an interesting dispute about that, about this article by Kant, what is enlightenment? And I add to this dispute the ideas by Vladimir Soloviev, who said that we are not adult right now. We are not yet adult. Till the end of the history, we will not have a chance to have that we are adult in a full sense. It's I think interesting. Chadaev, for example, it's even more impressive in this proposition in his philosophical lectures. And Fyodor Tyutchev, for example, Konstantin Leontiev, a big interesting tradition of a counter-enlightenment. And Soloviev, it's interesting that he would like to combine the enlightenment and counter-enlightenment, the conservative and liberal traits, the westernized ideas and the Slavophile ideas. He would just find a combination. I think it's interesting for Russia right now, because Russia right now would like to find this combination as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Edward Chalkowski is next.
Hi. So I actually don't know a ton about Soloviev, but and as you've discussed, he's clearly responding to Enlightenment ideas and specifically Kantian ideas regarding progress. But I'm wondering, given what's happening in his lifetime, particularly with industrialization in Western Europe, is he also perhaps responding or motivated by some concern with the level of industrialization that he's seeing in Europe, and particularly the ideas that are coming out of this? So you're seeing a lot of thinkers in Western Europe at this time who are declaring that we're conquering space and time and that we're moving beyond a medieval theocratic mindset that Europe had been trapped in. Is he sort of responding to something like that as well?
Yes, I think he's responding to the main European ideas, and I mentioned it, Francois Guizot, for example, not because he was a son, Vladimir Soloviev was a son of the most important, most prominent Russian historian of his time, Sergei Soloviev, and he knew ideas of many European Western historians. He answered on them. But I think he, in his treatise, he wrote much about Marxism, for example, about economical problems. He wasn't, it's interesting to think that Soloviev, the weakest part, the weakest chapter in his justification of good is a chapter about economical problems, because he wasn't competent in these problems, absolutely not competent. And especially in the journal version of his chapter about economic problems, you wonder how incompetent he was in these problems. But interesting to notice that he had followers, especially in this field, because many prominent, very liberal, for example, Russian philosophers of law, like Pavel Novgorodtsev, for example, or maybe you know Leon Petrozhitsky. He was very famous, not only in Russia, but in Europe as well. He absolutely have not so interested in his philosophical, common philosophical idea, but very interested in his recommendations of economic and social economical field. And his idea that the state is organized pity, not organized pity, but yes, organized pity, yes, correct. It's organized pity, that the pity is a foundation of our social politics, and we would like to correct our economical way of life by ideas of humanity, ideas of pity, and like that we need to correct economical matters by our humanistic and moral ideas. It was, I think, the most popular idea of which included in the justification of good, more popular than his chapter in which he even more competent about, for example, the foundations of a moral feeling and something like that, about piety, about conscience and something like that. And he, it's interesting to say that Soloviev became the founder of Russian social liberalism. It's interesting to say that as a social liberal thinker, he was very fruitful. But in other ideas, he was not so fruitful. But though he wasn't competent in this field of knowledge. I don't think about that. I don't think why, but I think that's maybe the main reason is that justification of good was a very strange treatise, because when it was published, all the contemporaries thought only one thing: in which camp we need to right now to put Vladimir Soloviev, in which camp he moved, in which camp to moved in his moral philosophy. And liberal thought that he wasn't in his camp because he stood for the theocracy, as I noticed. And populist and leftist especially rejected his idea. But the right observers too. And in his this treatise, he was just very alone. But for me, his aloneness, it was his plus, not minus. Yes, his advantage, not his disadvantage. Yes, you understand? I answer your question. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Vasily.
Thank you, Boris. It's a very interesting presentation, and I have a question about the. You talk about the response and the discourse that Soloviev provoked by his ideas among the Russian intellectuals. Some of them having like political leanings, some of them just pure intellectuals. But I'm curious about the actual state. How about those in power? If there is any traces of influence of Soloviev's ideas in like Russian bureaucracy,
right now or his time?
Now it's interesting in historical perspective. So you can talk about the late autocracy, late imperial Russia, and today. That's very interesting. I am asking, especially in the context of the recent theory that the great reforms in Russia was actually not the way to westernize the country, but rather to build a social utopia that preserved the harmony, social harmony of the classical autocracy by making progress, avoiding Western means and its connotations. Like,
yes.
Yeah,
I think it's correct. I think it's correct. What about the influence? You're correct about your final proposition, but what about influence? I think at that time, Soloviev really believed that he could take part in the just a composition, maybe it's correct, composition new Russian ideology, because in 1895, even the first year, the second maybe year of new Tsar, of the new ruling, the Nicholas II. And the Soloviev was a friend. And that time he had a collaboration with him. To him, his friend was Princess Peruktomsky, who was his pupil, his student in this Petersburg University. But at that time, he was a friend of Nicholas II, especially in the period when he was a Nikolai Alexandrovich, the Prince Nikolai Alexandrovich, Highness. And he joined Nicholas Alexandrovich in his trip along the Asia. Trip to Japan, for example, trip to India, to China. And many thought right now, and I wrote about that even Prince Peruktomsky was the person who moved Nicholas II toward Asia, and just to Siberia, for example, to Manchuria. And he was one of the person who was under the Far East policy with Sergei Witte. And Soloviev, of course, would like to be just in the circle of Russian bureaucracy, who just make new foreign policy, new domestic policy, and something like that. Not only him, but Prince Alexei Obolensky, for example, but just a big circle in Russian bureaucracy of this time, who was under influence, direct influence by Vladimir Soloviev. Prince Alexei Obolensky, for example, as you know, he was an author of Manifest 1905, which guaranteed liberties, rights, and just like a constitutional representation, representative State Duma, as you know, representation in Russia. And Soloviev thought that he may be one of the person who can, just one of the real ideologies of new Tsar. But it wasn't the case after this time, because many things occurred. One of them, Soloviev again opposed the inclination of Uktomsky and Witte toward the unity with China. He was against the unity with China. I think right now is very, maybe how to say, very actual, because he thought that we need to be in the unity with, for example, with Great Britain. He was an admirer of Great Britain, and with Germany. Not so with France, but with Germany and Great Britain. He would like to see Europe as a whole, and the Russian as a part of collective Europe, opposed to China. And it wasn't the policy of Uktomsky and especially Witte, and by that reason he opposed them. And I think in his light work, the three controversies, we saw the dispute with Witte and Uktomsky. And my hypothesis is that Witte is just Antichrist. We see the traits of Antichrist. And in Uktomsky, we saw the traits, we see the traits of anti-prophet, prophet Apollonian. It's absolutely, I think it's a very realistic proposition, very realistic conclusion, because many things, many traits of this character of chapter of the history of Antichrist reminded real Peruktomsky. And no, it's but right now right now, of course. Soloviev isn't a very popular figure in Russian conservative circles, because right now Soloviev was removed from maybe ideas of and views of Russian bureaucracy. Right now, Russian bureaucracy maybe more like Nikolai Berdiaev, for example, and Ivan Ilyin, and much more not so conservative. It's not so correct, I think, current title, current idea, but maybe more not so westernized like Soloviev. Soloviev was westernizer, but conservative westernizer, like Pyotr Chadaev. He not so liberal, but so very conservative, very counter-enlightenment, but westernizer. It's not so popular position right now in Russian conservative circles, and especially in Russian bureaucracy.
Okay, thank you. So let's take one more question in this part of the session. Zhuzha.
Yes, thank you. It's fascinating, and I preface my question by saying that I am a political scientist, so and a big fan of liberal democracy. So I'm actually asking from that perspective. So yes. I wonder, did Soloviev, as a conservative westernizer, have anything to say about accountability, about the question of whether the ruled can hold the rulers accountable, and how? Because this is another significant component of this relationship. It's not only representation and the other aspects that you spoke about, but I wonder whether he had anything to say about accountability.
Interesting question. I don't think, and so I think that maybe in the first part of his life, Soloviev thought about representation in Slavophile terms, because Slavophiles were for representation, but as you know, not in the constitutional terms. They would like to see like a Zemsky Sabor, council without the right to confront constitutionally the autocracy, but to have the only power of speech, power of free speech, not power of rule, and to make a law. So it wasn't the constitutional representation, but the representation with the only, how to say, совещательный голос, and just a no, maybe you know, understand what I'm talking about, but I think after that, in the later, he didn't speak about that so much. He was against Slavophiles, not only constitutional liberals and Slavophiles, and he said that he wouldn't like to see to have real meaning on representation and accountability, because he thought that it's not the case that the representation and the state Duma or something, council or parliament, would lead the society toward the right, toward the progress, toward the more superficial, to moral benefits and something like that. And he thought that the idea of just the enlightened autocracy, it was his idea, I think. Enlightened autocracy oriented toward progress, toward moral progress, against it's a popular idea of the 19th century in Russia, because autocracy was a main force of the emancipation of serfs in Russia, as you know, emancipation of Russian peasants. And he saw that we need only one thing. We need to emancipation of beliefs, the rights of beliefs. And he was the main idea that Russia must have the religious freedoms. And if we have religious freedoms, it was the case, it was his problems. And he even was against the free speech. Many his friends in the beginning of the new ruling of Nikolai II asked him to join the protest, asking to new Tsar to remove the censorship laws. And he was against them. He said, I was only for religious freedoms. It was my point. We need to guarantee people that they have belief in something that they believe. And if they have, I think it was a good autocracy. And it was his, maybe it is limitation. He has limitations. We need to see in him as a prophet. He was a thinker, very conservative thinker, but in the Russian situation, he occurred to be in liberal circles because he was against nationalism. He was very opposed nationalism, especially he was an enemy. He was against anti-Jewish policies, anti-Catholic policies, and that's why he thought that the liberal circles was more convenient for him, not conservative. I think it was his ideas.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Boris, for an excellent presentation, and to everyone for a very good discussion so far. And now we'll hand the virtual floor to Anna Siljak, who will speak to us about Berdiaev. Anna.
Hi, thank you. I am going to do something somewhat pedantic, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. I think it will help to make my presentation a bit clearer. So if you'll just excuse me for a second, I'm going to share my screen. And I think I have some quotes from Berdiaev. So can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to do the slideshow. All right. So as you can see from the title of my talk, this is going to be something completely different from Soloviev's ideas. And I'd like to begin with the quote. It's the biblical quote from Matthew: "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." And really, I think for Nikolai Berdiaev, there was no biblical passage that better described the necessary religious attitude towards the state, particularly the Christian attitude toward the state. He quotes this passage multiple times in multiple articles. And I have currently counted at least 3 uses of the title, the Kingdom of God and the Kingdom of Caesar, in Berdiaev's writing. It was the title of one of his books, a title of an article, a title of a book chapter. So he really referred to this dichotomy between the Kingdom of God and the Kingdom of Caesar repeatedly. Now, the label, the Kingdom of Caesar, I think essentially captures Berdiaev's attitude towards the state. From really the earliest years of his political thought until the end of his life, Berdiaev was suspicious of the state. And this, of course, only grew with time and with experience. And you can imagine that this actually culminated then in the 1930s when he was writing during the interwar period. So in the very beginning of his philosophical journey, for example, when he was a dedicated Marxist, he explicitly explained that he was drawn to the Marxist ideology because, in part, it promised to dismantle the Russian autocratic state. And after he moved away from Marxism and became increasingly drawn towards sort of more spiritual concerns and towards religion itself, his formal acceptance of Russian Orthodoxy was delayed because, as he wrote, the Russian Orthodox Church's historical attachment to Russian autocracy was an obstacle. And this was something he tirelessly attacked even after he joined the church in letters and public articles denouncing the Russian church-state synthesis. In his earliest writings as a Christian philosopher, he repeatedly asserted the preeminent importance of the separation between church and state and the need of the church to avoid the temptation of entering into politics And again, he repeatedly justified this hostility in biblical terms, right? The New Testament command to separate out what was Caesar's from what was God's. And he saw in this biblical passage that the Bible had compelled believers to see that the state was a necessary institution, but thoroughly fallen and always heading towards totalitarian control, and that it had to be radically separated from the church, the religious world, and what he called the kingdom of God. Now, in order to understand Berdiaev's hostility to the state, it's important to understand what was the sort of foundational element of his political philosophy, and that was his personalism, his interest in the human person. Berdiaev's earliest formulations of personalism were in fact Kantian. He was, and this is an interesting counterpoint to Mezhuev's, Professor Mezhuev's wonderful talk, that he was also a Kantian, but obviously derived very different Kantian ideas from Kantian philosophy. So in his earliest understanding of the human person, grounded in Kantian idealism, the individual human person is in essence an end in itself. Berdiaev explicitly attributes this idea to Kant, and the idea that the person is a value that cannot be calculated, and there is nothing higher than this individuality. Though he never really, I mean, the interesting thing about Berdiaev, he was a Marxist and then he was a Kantian, and though he later becomes an Orthodox Christian, he never really loses either Marxism or Kantianism. So I can talk about that if anyone has questions. He keeps this Kantian element in his personalist thought, but he later tries to ground human personality in God. And he argues that really personalism could not exist except without God. And so to find value in human life, he argues, the existence of personality presupposes the existence of God. Its value presupposes the supreme value. And so if there is no God as the source of suprapersonal values, personality as a value does not exist either. There is merely the individual entity subordinate to the natural life of the genus. And here we're going to see this dichotomy between spiritual and natural, which again, Berdiaev believes he derives from Kant, in which the world of the natural was the world of necessity and compulsion, whereas the world of the spiritual was the world of freedom, right? So personality had to be grounded in God in order to free itself from the realm of natural necessity. But God, for Berdiaev, does more for personality than just provide a kind of ontological grounding for personalism. God, in fact, creates persons. And so in 1916, in The Meaning of the Creative Act, which was really his first major philosophical work in the new Christian mode, Berdiaev asserts that each person is made in the image and likeness of God. And this is an assertion then philosophically that leads to a number of different implications for Berdiaev, for personhood. First of all, by being made in the image of God, a person shares in the infinite value of God. And that's what gives personality its infinite value. Second, because human beings are made in the image and likeness of an absolute being, human beings are more than just natural creatures. They are more than just material creatures. They are, in fact, and he repeatedly uses this kind of interesting spiritual argument, they are a little cosmos, which includes everything in itself. So one of the things that distinguishes persons from every other creature in the natural world is that the human being has the capacity to comprehend the cosmos, or at least a part of it, and is therefore far bigger than him or herself. And so as such, then each person is elevated above the empirical reality of the natural world and understands himself or herself as a spiritual fact outside of nature. And here, and this is again really interesting, I think, you can see that there is the influence of Soloviev's God-manhood in this definition of the person. Obviously, they came to very different political conclusions, but he certainly was indebted to Vladimir's premise of human beings being the divine humanity or the God man, right? People are at the same time material and spiritual, they are natural and they are divine, and this is what separates them from the rest of the natural world. And the final thing about personality that we have to understand is that because a person is made in the image and likeness of God, the person has a particular kind of what Berdiaev called positive freedom. The divine potential of humanity gives the human person the ability to be freed from Kantian necessity because of their divine essence, right? So human beings are not imprisoned by natural causes. And this was the distinction, actually, and this is actually a very interesting distinction he makes between the liberal individual and the human person. The individual for Berdiaev is a modern construct, one that's shaped by materialism and utilitarianism. And the modern individual has no aim or purpose than the satisfaction of material desires or the fulfillment of various interests or instincts. And so for Berdiaev, and he was quite categorical about this long, by the way, before Isaiah Berlin was, individuals have nothing but what he called negative freedom, the freedom from constraint, the freedom to follow their natural desires. But this was really no freedom at all in Berdiaev's universe. They were still, by being individuals, rooted in the world of natural necessity. They were at the mercy of their instincts and material desires. And so any freedom from constraint proved illusory. So what Berdiaev insisted on is that persons should have positive freedom, true human freedom, the freedom to create. A human being is a creative being called to what was called theurgy. This is a very Silver Age concept of co-creation with God or creativity in God's likeness. And this is then positive freedom, the freedom to create something out of nothing, which distinguishes persons from the rest of the material world, and is in fact also, I argue, you can ask me about this later, indebted to Marx, but is here given a theological twist. Okay, so positive freedom is the essential desire of every human person. If the person then is partly divine and partly natural, who must be free in order to fulfill a divine creative calling, then social and political consequences immediately follow. And so as early as 1902, then, Berdiaev insisted on the central importance of human rights as the essence of the relationship between the person and society and the person, and particularly the person and the state. The absolute value of the human person was the basis for what he called inalienable personal rights, which according to Berdiaev could be subordinated to no other principle, right? So no utilitarian principle could trump inalienable rights. And he wrote that legal and political progress for him was nothing other than the realization and the guarantee of the absolute natural rights of man. And these natural rights are not subject to any valuation, whether from the point of view of public benefit, public well-being, or even public adaptability. And for this reason, sort of logically speaking, all declarations of rights are grounded in religion. And he even says this about the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It says it's a religious document. It's not actually an Enlightenment document. For rights to be truly inalienable, this is kind of a Lockean idea as well, so that no will of the people and no power can take it away. Rights have to be grounded in what he called the transcendent, grounded in a higher will that grants to each person the inalienability of his or her rights. Moreover, these rights are rooted in a person's godlike nature. They presuppose the existence, for example, of the human soul. Now, this insistence on the primacy of individual personal rights, interestingly, he thought it actually would promote social harmony. I'm actually not going to go into it here for the interests of time, but if you want, I mean, I don't think he was quite good at balancing, say, rights with equality or rights with social justice, but he did believe that rights were the key to understanding these concepts. And so I can talk about these if people have questions later. But the most important thing is that the full freedom of the human person stood at the basis of Berdiaev's philosophy, and it directly determined how he would view the state. Now, Berdiaev was skeptical of the state, as I mentioned, quite early in his philosophical development. From very early on, he argued that the state is an institution that's built entirely for fallen humans. It's rooted in law, and every legal system is a legalization of man's distrust of man. The state is unavoidable, and he repeats this constantly. He clarifies, of course, that the state is necessary because even if I don't love my neighbor, I can't still steal or commit murder. So the state is there to prevent violence against others. But it is at best a necessary evil and contaminated with sin. Moreover, and you'll see this gets developed later in his thought, the state always tries to overstep its boundaries. It never stays limited. It's always, given the opportunity, going to take over more and more of human life. The state itself has no respect for the human person as an institution. And so the person and the state must be in a state of permanent distrust, one with another. And he wrote, the value of personality is hierarchically higher than that of the state. Personality belongs to eternity and the state to time. Personality bears the image and likeness of God, and the state does not. Personality is going toward the kingdom of God and may enter it, which the state never can. For this reason, the state itself cannot ever be a guarantor of rights, because the state is always corrupted by power and has no interest in the uniqueness of the human personality. Now, the state, in other words, it could declare the rights of the person, but the nature of its state, the abstract essence, the very concept of sovereignty, and here he's very opposed to the Enlightenment conception of sovereignty, especially later in life, very concept of sovereignty leads it to the violation of the essential rights of the person. And so he said, the rights of the person under a state still depend on human arbitrariness. And so rights in their deepest essence are not of state origin. They are not granted, distributed, or sanctioned by the state. Now, he did think that some types of states were better than others at given points in time, but no type of state is ideal. And in his view, democracy and autocracy alike can lead to tyranny, right? So again, it's the nature of the state, not the type of state that leads to the tyrannical. We can talk a little bit about his attitude towards liberalism. It was deeply conflicted. In theory, for him, it's the best political system because it's committed to individual rights, but in practice, modern liberalism was wedded to a kind of materialist and positivist individualism, right? A kind of atomism of the human person. And so positivistic and materialist liberals always tend towards suppressing the freedom of the person in the name of other utilitarian governmental criteria. Moreover, especially modern liberalism for him was rooted in capitalism, and that was an economic ideology he absolutely opposed. Again, the legacy of his Marxist upbringing, so that to the extent that liberalism is beholden to capitalism, it is also unable to protect the rights of the person. We can talk about that later. Now, I'm going to make sure I stay on track. After the Russian Revolution, obviously after the events of the 1930s, he began to use the term totalitarianism to describe the state, but he argued, very interestingly, that he was right all along, that all states tend towards totalitarianism. And what you're really seeing in the 1930s is the working out of a state essence throughout Western Europe and Russia. So he argued that the totalitarian state always wishes to be a church, to organize the souls of men, to exercise dominion over souls, over conscience, over thought, and to leave no room for the freedom of the spirit. So totalitarianism is totally expected given the nature of the state. Okay, so where was the rescue from the state? And here I think things get a little bit interesting. The rescue of the state comes in religion. and is specifically in the church. As revealed, as I said, in scripture, according to Berdiaev, the kingdom of Caesar should be irrevocably separated from the kingdom of God. And this would allow the full possibility of human freedom, especially freedom of religion. And so for him, in particular, right, in the first place, the separation of church and state confirmed the freedom of the church and freedom of religion. So that's so far so good, so liberal. But his most radical political claim was that rights could only be defended vis-a-vis the state with an extra political guarantor, or the church. So for Berdiaev, the separation of the kingdom of God from the kingdom of Caesar is the only way to guarantee the freedom and rights of the person. When the kingdom of God is separate from the kingdom of Caesar, the church is free from the state, and the church becomes its true self, which is the institution that protects and defends the person from the violations of the state. So the church would then proclaim the absolute value of each person, demand that the state protect the freedom of each person, and provide the pre-political grounding for universal human rights. So as he wrote, the free church signifies the affirmation of freedom of the state, the protection of the eternal rights of the human soul against the encroachments of state and society. So where's the catch? Well, as I said, he was quite a critic of what he called historical orthodoxy. So when he speaks of the church, he speaks of what he calls the true church, right? The true church is always free. The true church, by definition, can contain no compulsion. Members enter freely and cannot be prevented from departing freely as well. There is no dogma that is coerced or enforced. The church has the obligation to defend and preserve the truth of religion, but by definition, it could not compel or coerce belief. And so the freedom of conscience was paramount for Berdiaev. It was the highest of all freedoms, the freedom to choose to believe or not to believe, for example. He was consistently opposed to even the attack on heretics and the persecution of heresy. And he strongly believed that even the most egregious heresies had to be, as he put it, countered with, church truth rather than any kind of coercion. And in fact, it was the temptation of the church to persecute heretics that led to the historical church's greatest era, which is entering into a compact with the state, or theocracy. All Christian denominations, according to Berdiaev, were guilty of this conflation of the kingdom of God with the kingdom of Caesar. They were all guilty of theocracy. The Pope was a perfect example, but so also was the Russian Tsar. And I mean, you can see here how much he hated this aspect of the Russian Orthodox Church. So he denounced it as blessing autocracy, submitting to imperialism, accepting the Tsar as the head of the church, and ready to bow down at every instance to the prince of this world, right? So sort of a devilish, the theocratic impulse is a devilish or demonic impulse that the church sometimes conforms to. Now, so what is Berdiaev's, well, you can imagine now, what is Berdiaev's ideal form of government? He argued that it was anarchy. Now, how serious was he about anarchy? You get conflicting things in his writings, but you can see in this quote exactly what he means by desiring anarchy. Whoever is not an anarchist in his heart loves violence and power in principle. So really, I think what this quote shows you is that the desire should be for anarchy, even if anarchy is presently impossible. So the ideal state, the kingdom of God, is anarchy. Now, okay, that's really interesting and kind of idiosyncratic in a way, although there is really a legacy of Christian anarchism, especially in the Silver Age, of which Berdiaev is a part. So he's not all alone in his Christian anarchism. But what I kind of would like to just spend a few minutes talking about is Berdiaev's legacy in the West with this ideal that he had. So his significance in the Western intellectuals, specifically interwar tradition, is that of personalism. And it was Samuel Moyn in his Christian Human Rights book in 2015 that argued that French personalism was in fact responsible for our modern attachment to universal human rights. Religious personalism for Moyn was the driving force behind everything we value about rights today. And more than any other secular philosophy, the fact that we talk about universal human rights is indebted to Catholicism. Now, he caused quite a stir. The Catholics, of course, were very happy to accept this as a sort of story of their historical legacy. But of course, Moyn did not mean this as a compliment. He's very opposed to human rights as a principle. He thinks it's a kind of insidious way in which states try to control other states, among other things. And so he wants to cast suspicion on the human rights movement by suggesting that, you know, human rights is part and parcel of a reformulation of conservatism in the name of a vision of moral constraint, not human emancipation or individual liberation. So he credits the origins of human rights to Jacques Maritain, who did work on, who was a French personalist and did in fact help to write the Universal Declaration on Rights. So he's of course on solid ground there, that Maritain's personalism did lead to his espousal and continued defense of universal human rights. But what I would like to bring up is the influence of Berdiaev's personalism on the French personalism that led us there. And I think that is quite clear historically. Berdiaev met Jacques Maritain in 1925. From 1926 to 1928, he participated in a series of conversations with him and other thinkers in the Russian Academy of Paris, including Etienne Gilson and Emmanuel Mounier. So he was really part and parcel of the French personalist movement. And many of Berdiaev's insights into the rights of the person and the relationship to the state became really crucial pillars of the French Catholic personalist ideal. And I can give you an example. Emmanuel Mounier's Personalist Manifesto contains many elements that are very strikingly similar to that of Berdiaev, including the argument that personalism should look to anarchism as its ideal state. And Jacques Maritain was less anarchist, although he also tended to anarchism at times, but he argued for a rights-based communitarian politics in which the person placed limits on state power and economic exploitation. There were other people who were tremendously influenced by Berdiaev directly, but also Berdiaev through the French personalists. And I'll just mention two. I can talk about others. One was Dorothy Day. The Catholic worker movement was very indebted to a kind of French Catholic personalism and to Berdiaev's ideologies in particular. She actually credits Berdiaev with her inspiration for a kind of Catholic socialism. And I've also found very interesting evidence. Martin Luther King Jr. Called himself a personalist and wrote a thesis on, believe it or not, Jacques Maritain and Nikolai Berdiaev and their contributions to the Christian idea of personalism. Okay, so two brief takeaways of this. And I think this is really interesting juxtaposition with Professor Mezhuev's contribution as well. Russian personalism, I think, is an intriguing counterpoint to the Russian statism of which I think Soloviev was a part, right? There's a real heritage of it. And I particularly liked Professor Mezhuev's article on the subject where, you know, Soloviev in some sense is trying to justify his own father's statism, right? Trying to come up with a way in which you could make a kind of progressive argument about the Russian state and trying to reformulate that, ideal. What's interesting is what Berdiaev does is he takes so many of Soloviev's insights, and I think Professor Mezhuev is absolutely correct in this, that Soloviev's ideal of the theocracy fades away while his other ideals get taken up by the Silver Age, right? So you could see he's being used, Soloviev is being used to entirely different ends. And there is, I think, a non-traditional, non-conservative Orthodox human rights intellectual tradition, of which Berdiaev was a part. And I think also Berdiaev is an interesting counterpoint to what I find very disturbing these days of a kind of fascination with the ideologies of Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben, you know, this sort of love, this sort of fear / love of the state, this idea that the state is everywhere and sort of ever more powerful. And it allows us, Berdiaev's thinking on this, I think, allows us to interrogate this worldview and to give a kind of ideal of a kind of transcendental grounding of human rights that could counteract some of this fascination with sovereignty and the all-encompassing power of the state. So perhaps we need more anarchism and less statism. All right, so with that, I'm going to end my PowerPoint presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions any of you have about this.
Thank you, Anna. So the floor is open for questions.
Might be one question.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you say, thank you for an interesting presentation of ideas of anarchism in Berdiaev's thought, but how can we evaluate from this point the ideas proposed by Berdiaev in the philosophy of inequality? The conservative Berdiaev, which cited Joseph the Master very favorably. Berdiaev, who cited, who spoke about new Middle Age in his famous work. Is it just an incorrect Berdiaev? Maybe I know he after that rejected his ideas. But what was the origin of this rejection? Is it maybe we can say that it's just a inclination of Berdiaev from his own way, correct way, which was combined with ideas of anarchism and idea of the religious freedom and religious liberalism and something like that. What do you think about that? So
yes, he's in one of his, I think his Destiny of Man, he said, "I do not apologize for the contradictions in my thought." You know, so he was very much, I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of, so he spent a lot of time talking about the philosophy of inequality, you're absolutely right, and defending inequality and aristocratic traditions, for example, right? So he did spend some time doing that. Again, weirdly, again, in a kind of attempt to liberate the person from what he saw an excessive Marxist emphasis, for example, on equality above the person. He also did go through, I should also add, he did go through a phase in during World War I where he tried to defend the state against revolutionary elements, right? So he said, you know, the state is necessary, you have to have the state. Anyone who claims that you can't have a state is actually lying to you. So he did go through these phases. But I would point something out about the New Middle Ages, which I think is worth exploring, and I haven't fully explored it yet. But I think it's the French fascination with the New Middle Ages is an oddly, this may seem like a leap, but bear with me, an oddly kind of Foucaultian idea that actually in the Middle Ages, people are freer than they are after the advent of modern liberal capitalism. Because industrialization, and here he's weirdly, again, Marxist, right? Objectification, industrialism, the advent of the machine, all of this leads to kind of objectification of human beings and a kind of homogenous idea of state sovereignty that goes with it, that perhaps, you know, in trying to reassess the Middle Ages, we would see them differently than we do now, right? So instead of seeing them as this kind of traditional conservative theocratic world, we can see them as the forebears of the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance starts in the Middle Ages. Gilson argued this as well, and it's not a surprise that he was part of this group as well, a kind of reformulation or a reorientation of our attitude towards the Middle Ages. And I think he was definitely part of that in his still proto-Marxist, or whatever I call it, you know, sort of his Marxist ideal of liberal capitalism being this kind of objectification and enslavement of the human spirit throughout history.
Thank you.
Monica Wozniak.
Thank you for the lecture. It was wonderful. Don't you think that there is nevertheless a shift, and it comes from a shift in metaphysics? And I also think that his attitude towards anarchy is changing in time a bit, and it can be seen especially in his works on Tolstoy, which were really, he was really hostile towards him in the conservative period, if we call it that, and his attitude is definitely warmer in 30s, I would say, until his death. So my question would be, do you think that it's just a contradictory character of his thought, or there are nevertheless changes, and maybe quite major ones?
I was struck, I mean, in a way, yes, there are times and distinct historical times and places where he is in fact contradicting the story I say here. It's not as linear, though, as you might expect. In other words, there are a lot of places over time where he actually praises Tolstoy. He was vehemently opposed to the excommunication of Tolstoy, even though, right, Tolstoy himself rejected the power of the Orthodox Church. And so there are phases where, so for example, right after he leaves Marxism and is kind of entering into his anti-Marxist phase, he starts to critique, for example, equality and kind of homogenization, right, as a kind of anti-Marxist attitude. And then also, again, as I said, in World War I, for example, completely uncharacteristically for the rest of his thought, he defends war, he defends the state. In the early years of the revolutionary movement, he's defending the state against those who would destroy it, right? So there are these contextual moments where he definitely goes against his wider philosophical views. So I think there's no doubt of that. But what's odd about it is that it's almost like changes of the moment, contextual moment, rather than a kind of linear pattern of first this and then that, if that makes sense. And I have a friend who's actually written about the sort of wartime period, World War I period, in Russian Silver Age thought. And it's very clear that they are all going through this moment of nationalist messianism and pro-war sentiment and, you know, against the German, you know, national spirit. And then as things collapse, they start to reevaluate once more. And so in the 20s and 30s, he becomes kind of back, he cycles back to a kind of pre-revolutionary worldview, if that makes sense. I haven't worked out quite the timings of these things, but the contradictions seem more erratic than linear, if that makes sense.
Hey, Vladimir Marchenkov.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna, for your wonderful presentation. This is not so much a question as a remark, and perhaps an invitation to others to weigh in. I wonder if we can think of Berdiaev not so much in terms of this linear project of replacing something with something else. I think he was pretty explicit already from the смысл творчества, and especially, of course, going on into the new Middle Ages and beyond, that he was trying to synthesize modern progressivism with medieval eschatology. And so his project, in my opinion, needs to be viewed in this light. And the second point I wanted to make is about his methodology. And again, he acknowledged very openly that his method was not philosophical. So mythopoeia for him was the origin of philosophy and was of primary significance. And then philosophy came along only to explain what was revealed in myth. And so his contradictions are not contradictions from the, of course, from the philosophical point of view. And he loved antinomies for that. And he's one of the most antinomic thinkers of the 20th century and in the Russian Silver Age as well. He saw antinomies as quite natural, because for him, philosophy fell apart itself into antinomic thinking, and that was the hallmark of philosophy. But it didn't bring about, it was incapable of bringing about the synthesis of the opposing parts of those antinomies. The synthesis could only be brought about mystically. So when we put Berdiaev in this light and vis-a-vis philosophy and acknowledge the primacy of mystical thinking for him over and above philosophical thinking, his contradictions are then cast in a different light than a philosopher, contradictions of a philosopher who is trying to construct a coherent a rational system, but falls into contradictions nonetheless because of one fault or another. For Berdiaev, that problem is irrelevant. Well, at least so. Yes, I'll be very curious to hear what others think on this subject.
Let me just respond really briefly. I think you're absolutely right. One thing I didn't bring up here. He loved to play around with words, right? So he actually said at one point, theocracy is anarchy. And so that's kind of a wonderful perspective. But from his point of view, theocracy, if you break it down, is the rule of God. So therefore, any man who rules under theocracy would be calling himself God. That means he would be the Antichrist, so he wouldn't be God. And therefore, the rule of God means no rule of men. So theocracy, the only legitimate interpretation of theocracy was anarchy, which again, doesn't get us very far, but was a perfect example of how he liked to play around with concepts to get people to sort of, to sort of expose the contradictions in people's thinking. So yes, he loved to play around with those things, and he called himself a mystical philosopher. And he really, and that's what I think people find frustrating about him as a writer, right? On the one hand, he's repetitious. On the other hand, he's contradictory. And so it's hard to make sense of him. But I think you're right that in a way, his job was to constantly shift us out of where we are now into something else. And so that's why, his anarchism is purely eschatological, right? It's not that he actually thinks today we're going to create anarchism here. It's just that's the sort of dream of humanity is anarchy. And that's why he calls it the kingdom of God. So. Yes.
If I can follow up with a comment on this, I also think that when we discuss issues or philosophers' attitudes, like Soloviev and Berdiaev's attitudes towards the state, we need to bear in mind their own personal hierarchies, philosophical hierarchies that they have, the priorities, we would say today. Just how important is the issue of the state for Soloviev and for Berdiaev? Not very. It is not at the top of their priorities, of their philosophical, mystical priorities, whatever you. Because Soloviev was also a mystical philosopher and openly acknowledged that. I think we need to bear in mind that to apply the question about their attitude towards anarchy as a lens into their entire philosophical persona would give us a distorted picture. We need to apply probably their lens in order to understand their attitude towards anarchy as an item on the list of their priorities, not the other way around.
I think that's right. That's exactly
okay.
right.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Zhuzhe.
Yes, thank you, Anna. This is terrific. And so when you were talking about Berdiaev's idea of positive freedom in spirituality, and later on when you I don't remember exactly, but you quoted briefly something he said about totalitarian state wishing to be the church. And so I'd like to ask you, I know I'm simplifying this, but what did he say about how the church was different from the state as an institution? The church, not faith and spirituality, but the church as an institution is essentially a bundle of rules, right? Rules about how people should live, what they should eat and when, and rules about worship and all that. So did he actually say anything about how his idea of the perfect church is anarchy and church as it actually exists differs from state?
Well, so yeah, so that's a problem with Berdiaev and his vision of the church, is that you have to immediately clarify and know that he didn't actually mean the actual existing Orthodox Church as it was during his time. Because for him, there was no way that that church could do anything except submit to an autocratic state, right? So this was the essential corruption of his view of the church was, for those of you who are familiar, Chomyakov's idea of subordinist, right? So in other words, the living church is both far bigger than and somewhat narrower than the institutional church. It is a living organism. It transcends time and space. And when a believer enters it freely, that believer is open to all of the insights and revelations that the church has provided through the centuries, okay? So it does have a set, he was a very big believer in foundational moral values. So the church does stand for certain foundational moral values, especially in regards to the person. It does teach certain truths which are useful to the person in terms of their development in time, right? So, you know, he defended, for example, apostolic succession, which is very traditional. He defended the real presence in communion, right? So it was very traditional in some aspects. Where he differed from the institutional church, and he was very specific about this, for example, with the papacy. He said the problem with the Catholics is that they want a set of rules with the Pope to guarantee them, and that then abolishes the central purpose of the church, right? In other words, for him, really, there is no dogma that can be externally coerced, if that makes sense. So in other words, even, and he lived this to a greater degree than he lived many of his other philosophical beliefs. There is heresy, and heresy is harmful, but the church can do no more than stand on its own truth. It can't expel heretics, it can't coerce heretics, it can't demand that they recant their beliefs, it can't persecute them in any way, it can't send armies against them, right? It can't kill them. So for him, the primacy was freedom. So you freely accept and believe and enter into this historical universal church, or you decide not to, but that the role of the church wasn't to compel behavior or belief in any way, shape, or form. That's the difference. Now that's, again, it's the ideal church. It's not any really existing church, Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. So you could again say it's kind of like anarchy. It exists in this kind of ideal type, probably in some eschatological future. But the more that the existing church follows this ideal, the more likely it will be a source for defending the rights of the person. And the less it does it, the less it will be that, if that makes sense.
May I ask just one follow-up question? Did he say anything about what happens to those who opt out?
That's entirely up to their own conscience.
I know, but does he say anything about how they exist?
No, he was actually a Christian universalist. He believed everyone was saved. To him, I mean, we could get into the concept of hell, but he had a very interesting understanding of hell as a kind of this worldly Kantian imprisonment in necessity, right? And the church liberates you from hell, the hell of your present existence, which seems eternal to you. He did not believe in an eternal hell. He was very explicit about that. So hell was a kind of revised thing for him. It was more universalist.
So we have a question from Edward, but before I give Edward the floor, I should say we're coming towards the end. So I'd like to invite further questions which can be directed to either speaker or the synthesis of both positions. Edward, over to you.
Hi, Dr. Siljak. So I guess my question in some way is related to what was just discussed, but there is sort of a prevailing notion, or there has been in historiography, suggested by some, that 19th century Russia was more, I suppose, culturally, socially, even politically medieval than a lot of other European states at the time. And you know, just considering the two people in question today, Soloviev and Berdiaev, you know, especially Berdiaev, you know, there's some aspects of his thought that one might characterize as more medieval, such as his interest in mysticism, but of course the very his advocacy for anarchy in itself actually contradicts the whole basis for a common medieval culture, Christendom. So with this in mind, do you think that particularly Berdiaev in his thought in any way demonstrates the notion that Russian intellectual culture, society, etc., were in some ways more concerned with medieval than other European states, or is it not so simple as that?
Oh, with Berdiaev, it's never that simple. So he was indebted, of course, to a lot of what the Slavophiles argued. So in a way, yes, he felt that Russia had perhaps been preserved from some of the excesses of modernity, but in reality, his love of the Middle Ages was of a distinctly European Middle Ages. And if you look at his writing, The End of Our Time or The New Middle Ages, he's really talking, I mean, he's in love with the Italian Renaissance, the early Italian Renaissance, right? And the sort of sees the European Middle Ages as sort of going towards the Italian Renaissance. In a way, the Russian Silver Age was nicknamed the Russian Renaissance precisely because what they wanted to do was kind of import an image of a kind of Italian Renaissance into Russia, something that they hadn't had yet, right? So it was very contradictory. In other words, it's really hard to characterize his thought, but I don't think he was celebrating a Russian middle. I haven't seen evidence yet, and perhaps someone else can correct me if so, but I haven't seen evidence of his celebration of the Russian Middle Ages in particular. Rather, and this is what made him so influential in French personalist circles, was that he was kind of celebrating the European Middle Ages, right? As a precursor to the Renaissance. So the late Middle Ages, if you will, as a precursor to the Renaissance. It's weird, the similarity between him and Gilson in that. So it's not really surprising that they're kind of part of that same group.
Thank you.
By the way, I'll just end on this. I see so much of Foucault in a lot of this, which is weird, right? But that kind of celebration of the kind of essentially anarchic quality of the Middle Ages as opposed to the modern universe, it's a very interesting kind of lineage that you can trace through French intellectual thought.
Can I make a comment? Sorry, David.
No, of course.
If I'm not stepping on anyone's toes.
Not at all.
Because that's this medieval nature of Russia in the 19th century. I think there is a nuance there that needs to be taken into account. Russia was an absolute monarchy from what, the end of the 17th century until the beginning of the 20th. And absolute monarchy is not a medieval political order. It's the first modern political order in Europe, in France, in Spain, in Great Britain, elsewhere. But it was behind the European absolute monarchies that fell earlier, sometimes a century earlier, and other times were transformed, like the British monarchy was transformed into a constitutional monarchy. So to call it a medieval arrangement is somewhat inaccurate, because it's a different political animal from medieval monarchy. Just a nuance.
Okay. I mean, maybe I could ask Anna to say more about the notion of freedom as it emerges in Berdiaev. Particularly, you talked about the concept of positive freedom, which you thought had some connection to his early interests in Marxism. It also, of course, has some precedent in Kant's notion of sort of free collective, free spontaneous intellectual activity and so on. So I just wondered if I could say a bit more about that, but also, I mean, you invoked Berlin's famous distinction, which of course he wants to approve of things the other way round. But do you, I mean, this is a mischievous question, but do you think there's any influence of Berdiaev on Berlin in offering up that sort of dichotomy? Because I mean, Berlin was of course a Russianist, so I just wonder if there might be some precedent there.
I mean, the weird thing about Berdiaev that I've discovered over time is that you wouldn't be surprised if people were influenced by him. I mean, again, I was just shocked at the number of people in, especially in the interwar period, who openly were indebted to Berdiaev and said, you know, Hannah Arendt, for example, Eric Vogelin, all these big intellectual thinkers mention Berdiaev or credit him or don't in particular times. So to be honest, I wouldn't be entirely surprised, especially since he does that neat trick of sort of inverting it, right? So saying, and here's where I'll answer your first question. So I've been working on this quite a bit. And what's interesting about Berdiaev is that he's attracted to Marxism not primarily out of a sense of social justice or equality, but rather out of Marx's conception of freedom. And so he says this quite explicitly. He saw Marx as a philosopher of freedom and not particularly as a philosopher of social justice, and in particular of liberation from capitalist objectification and the whole mindset of the capitalist world, right? So in other words, property, for example, seeing other people as possessions, seeing the world as a possession was an enslaving fact of Marxism. And Marx, of course, identifies freedom as free labor, right? So the human being is most fulfilled when he is creating something out of the material world, right? I mean, he calls it labor, right? But it is creative labor for Marx that liberates the human being, not enslaved labor, but creative labor. And though later, of course, Berdiaev grounds his idea of creativity in theurgy, right? So the very explicit religious principle, I think you cannot get away from the fact that he's really kind of transposing Marx's idea of free labor into a kind of religious key, right? That what distinguishes us from the animals, our ability to create something, right? Positive freedom, the ability to create something, to control nature and to create out of it a thing of beauty, rather than to be enslaved to the natural world and to the economic processes of it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, we're coming close to the time we're supposed to stop, though I don't know what significance that norm has in a Zoom Zoom world. So let me take a couple of further questions. Rebecca.
Hi, thank you both for very thought-provoking presentations that challenged. I'm a historian of the 20th century, so challenged some of my sort of the views I had of both of these thinkers. I was struck that one of the sort of grounds, the common grounds between Soloviev and Berdiaev, as presented in the talks today, was a insistence on religious freedom. And I wondered if both speakers might be willing to say a little bit more about the sort of genealogy of that commitment to religious freedom that clearly came from very different perspectives in both of these thinkers, or from different sort of points of view.
Go ahead.
Yes, I think the main interesting thing in distinction between Soloviev and Berdiaev, that Soloviev lived in the period when the dispute was against the persons who was for secularization, and they opposed clerical and religious tyranny. They thought about secularization, and that who was against secularization, because they thought that after secularization it was a chaos, moral anomy, and something like that. For example, Nikolai Berdiaev was one of them. He wrote about it in his treatise Russian and Europe. And Berdiaev lived in the period when the maybe more important theme was the theme of religious freedom, freedom of church, the emancipation of church from the state. It was another topic. And I think that Berdiaev thought and wrote not so much about secularization, about what to do with society. Need we emancipate society from the religion? Soloviev must think about that. And he saw that he was against secularization. His ideal was England. He thought that England is the best. It was we have in England. England had state church, and he wasn't against it. But at the same time, England was very tolerant at that time. Tolerant toward the beliefs, toward the atheists, for example, and something like that. That's he thought that even that if Russia could tolerate another religions, another churches, and other beliefs, he thought that even only by that he could become the great power. He combined the successes of the state in the foreign policy and the religious freedom. Prince Evgeny Trubetskoy criticized him for that, because he thought that it's impossible to make this combination, to the connection between successes in the foreign policy and religious freedom. It's not so correct from the critical point of view, but it was uncritical predisposition by Soloviev. He thought that it's impossible to make a big, great society without the religious toleration. It was, I think, his idea. And another problem for Berdiaev, it was an emancipation of church, to make church more liberated from the state. Not you correct about submission of the church to state. They were against them, and even all new religious consciousness. Berdiaev was part of that. Was the main purpose of this movement was to liberate the church, but at the same time, the proponents of new religious, Christian religious consciousness, didn't think much about the problem of secularization. I think it wasn't his topic during all of his life, I think, I suppose.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely right. I think Boris is absolutely right. For Berdiaev, it was liberation from the state. It was a two-front war for him, obviously, because at first, I mean, it's really striking from modern terms to see how openly the church argued against freedom of conscience, for example, even as late as the 1890s, right? So you have these religious philosophical discussions in which the hierarchs are saying we cannot tolerate freedom of conscience because religion is not about freedom of conscience, right? There is the truth and you have to, accept the truth. You can't decide for yourself what's true and what's false. So he was fighting a two-front war, first against them, and then of course later against, right? So he's living through the revolution. He emigrates in 1922, right? So at that point, he is thinking about the freedom of the church from what is essentially a secular state. And I think Boris is right. He talks about secularization, but really only as a kind of failure of Christianity, right? Secularization was necessary because the church did not live up to its purpose and meaning and mission. And therefore, he called Marxism, and it was very interesting. He said, the truth and lie of Marxism. He wrote an article about it. He said, well, the truth of it is that because Christians didn't do what they were supposed to, you had to have Marxism, because Marxism was the only one that would care for. I should point out that though he was an anarchist, Berdiaev was extremely where he was highly egalitarian was in the economic sphere. And again, it's a legacy of his Marxism. So he was not a libertarian, right? And he was not pro-capitalist. He was very much for social welfare in this regard. But the freedom of the church was absolute for him in this two-front war against the churches and against the secular state.
Okay, so Vasily and I agreed in the chat that we would continue to about 2:15 if that's okay with everyone. So there are two more questions. Zsuzsa, so then Monica.
So I'd like to ask Professor Mezhuev about the following. Today, the Russian intellectuals today who are writing about the role of the church, the role of religion, what are the questions, the bigger questions that motivate them today? Oops, you're muted.
Yeah.
You're muted. You are muted.
But Boris, we can't hear you. Oh, can we?
Can we unmute?
Oh. Oops, you're still muted, Boris.
He's still muted.
Oh, there he is. Now he's okay.
Yes.
Yes. Please repeat your question.
Yeah. So you know how this question of whether thinkers, philosophers, intellectuals are entirely consistent and coherent in what they are writing about and what they emphasize, and whether there is some logic to the issues that they are raising. It just triggered this question in me that this is an important time as well for Russia. And so I wonder what might be the big questions that today's Russian intellectuals, philosophers, graduate students, PhD students are writing that question.
Yes, right. I think that the problem of secularization is very important right now in Russian philosophy. Especially we right now are reading much about post-secularist studies and post-secularization, and we wonder what it is. And the idea of post-secularization make much more important, much more actual these ideas, because we have special secularization in Russia. Our secularization was the result of Russian Revolution. And we changed our attitude to many advantages or many disadvantages, many results of Russian Revolution, especially Bolshevist revolution. And right now we don't have any common idea of how to think about secularization, what it is. Is it our fate? Is it our necessity? What are the limits of secularization? What are the problems of, is it the new ethics, for example, which right now is popular in the West, is the necessary step of the secularization, or is it just maybe exit of the secularization from its necessary limitations? Right now, it's I think a very important thing. And right now, when I am studying the justification of good, I think I of course saw many interesting questions, which right now is very, very actual in Russia, especially about the limits of secularization. Because for Vladimir Soloviev, for example, it was an open question. He started his publications for moral philosophy from the categorical proposition, categorical of statement of the autonomy of moral philosophy from the religion. And in 3 months, he wrote another article in which he wrote absolutely another thing, that the religion is very connected with moral connected with religion, and it's impossible to imagine a consistent moral philosophy without religious foundations. And I think it's just a contradiction, as many showed on this contradiction on Vladimir Soloviev, but it's just a contradiction of contemporary Russia. Do we have a special moral foundation without religion, or maybe no religion isn't consistent at all for a new moral? And right now, I think maybe we're just speaking about many other important things in our philosophy of conscience, for example, philosophy of consciousness. But right now, the very important thing, a very important topic in our contemporary moral discourse is a problem of the connection between politics and religion, society and religion, family and religion, family values and religion. I think I don't think more actual topic, a more actual theme in the Russian discourse than that.
Okay, thank you. So for the very last question goes to Monica. You need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. It is a very short question about a very minor detail that nevertheless bothers me somehow. If I'm not mistaken, in the text about the meaning of the states, this is a question for Professor Mezhuev. The title of the text, although it sounds very similar in English, the meaning of the state and the meaning of law, in the text of the state, Soloviev, if I'm not mistaken, uses a different word. Do you think that this difference is of any significance, or it just is it just a linguistic minor detail without any significance for example, in translation to other languages and stuff like that?
Boris, you need to unmute.
You mean the difference between the words смысл and значение? Yes, am I correct? It's an interesting question, because Soloviev wrote 2 articles, the meaning of love, meaning of wars, with a one concept, смысл, sense. But we need to correct it, I think, sense. But meaning of state, maybe it's more practical. Might be. Maybe he would like to stress more practical connection, practical connotation of the word meaning, значение. I don't think, I don't know about that. Maybe maybe the more practical thing. Maybe he would like to because his article in the same year, 1895, The Meaning of War, was a very scandal. It was very just a scandal in the liberal circles. He was just condemned that he for war. He approved the war. He militarized, many other accusations. And after that, he didn't want to connect this article with an article which was published only half a year ago. And that's why he would like to not to make a connection between these two articles. And by that reason, he used another word for that. But it's only my hypothesis, not more.
Okay. Well, at this point, I think it's time to draw our seminar to a close. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic event. And I want to thank the two speakers very much indeed for really excellent talks. And also to thank the audience, which is it's a very international audience. It's great to see so many people coming from all over the world. That's about the only good thing about the pandemic, is that it has made possible these it's made very easy international seminars where people can come from all over, and so that's wonderful. So thank you very much indeed to our speakers and to everyone for coming.
And I just want to say, I didn't say thank you to David and to Vasily. I especially Vasily, thank you so much for putting this together. Vasily, you've done a wonderful job during this pandemic and keeping these events going. And so I apologize I didn't say it before my talk, so I'm jumping in to say thank you and thank you to David, and thank you to Boris for agreeing to do this. So I'm just very grateful.
Thank you for your introduction and this wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So if you are visiting Rees for the first time and you'd like to be on the mailing list, then do please, I think our website has details of how to keep in touch with us, or email me or Vasily. We'd love to keep you abreast of our events. Vasily, do you have any announcements about upcoming things to conclude?
Yes, just a few words. We set the date, I believe it's May 10. I don't yet have time, but I will let you know. And it's going to be the event in our End of History series. And it's going to be the memory politics in Poland with two speakers. Dariusz Stola, the former director of the Polin Museum of Jewish Heritage in Poland, and Michal Trevich, who's the current director of research in the same museum, moderated by Professor Piotr Wrobel, professor of Polish studies at University of Toronto. So all invited. If we do have something in the meantime, I will let you know. So yeah, thank you, Sven. Sven reminds me it's 10 to 12, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time, May 10. Okay, thank you all for attending. I thank you very much, really.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Many thanks for moderation. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.